We've been going through talking about a lot of different things recently, both the start of the sermon series and the start of each sermon, and even the sermon series itself, are things that we've been starting to develop over the last 6 months or so. And as Joel and I were talking about these things, we started to realize that we knew what we wanted to do, but we really didn't completely know exactly what we were trying to do or how to accomplish it. And so that's what most of this has been about, us trying to put it into words, to figure out, to not only help ourselves out, but also to help all of you out to understand the direction. And so that's why we have these things, our vision and our mission and all these other parts of it. And I'm sort of switching it up a little bit, and I'll show you the reasoning behind it here in a second. But our mission here at this church is to be maturing disciples who are making disciples directed by God's Word. Now, obviously, you could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I do want to make one point before we go into the rest of this, and it's the point that this isn't just simply the thing that us leaders are supposed to be doing, but it's what all of us are supposed to be doing. Obviously, some of the wording is specifically for the way that we're coming about it, but each and every one of you has a part in this if you're truly a disciple of Christ. And so that's what we're trying to show you through this sermon series that's coming up. But this is a process that all of us are participating in. And so when we get to the vision of planting His words of life, it all comes down to the fact this is what we want all of us to be doing together, because if it's just a few of us doing it, it's not going to go very far as if everyone is participating in it and helping out in it. And obviously we all do this in different ways and different manners, but this is the ultimate goal for what we're trying to do. We're trying to reach out to people and help them see the truth. And obviously, just like if you're planting something, not every single seed's going to completely take root or grow into what it's supposed to be, but it's the effort that we're putting into it to give it every chance to do that is what we're truly talking about here. And as we get into this sermon series, it's not just being disciplized, but it's actually knowing His words of life. And this is sort of why I put the vision right before this, is because if we really want to be planting it, we have to first know what it is. We have to know His words of life to be able to share them and help lead others in that same process. And this knowing isn't just about the head knowledge that comes along with this, but it's also about intimately knowing who God is and what He's all about that comes along with it. Because something that just sticks in your brain doesn't necessarily completely change you. It has to become a part of who you are and go even deeper than that. That you have to know things at a deeper level than just simply the knowledge of it for it to truly make a difference in your life. And so even with the sermon I have today, my hope is to go beyond just giving you simple reasons for it, but to show you how it also somewhat plays out in our lives. And we've already discovered going through this series what the gospel message actually is, and the response we have to it, that we have to choose to accept it and to be heading in a completely different direction and have our lives changed completely. And if you don't fully understand that or want to know more, you can start by either looking at or watching those first two sermons or coming and talking to any of us about it. Because we want you to fully know and understand everything that it means to be following Christ and that whole process behind it. And so that's where it starts. And then the sermon that we're going to have today, along with the previous 3 sermons, sort of all work together. They're things that are going on more or less at the same time. It's not that it's one stage to the other, and for different people it might even happen in different directions, but they all are things that have to be happening in our lives. And so obviously, if you remember them, it's recognizing God's work, specifically what God has done through people and seeing it, because you can't truly head in that direction unless you see what it looks like in the very first place. And so it sort of, in some sense, begins there. That's one of the first things that typically happens. You also have to be seeking biblical training, just like Austin talked about a few weeks ago. You have to actually know the truth, again, like knowing His words of life before you can do anything about it. If you just go off of your own thoughts and beliefs, you're probably going to head in a direction that's not quite the right direction. You might get some parts right. You have to really know the entirety of the truth to actually, be doing it in the right manner. And then last week, Joel talked about how we have to be walking toward Christ's likeness, that we have to actually be heading in that direction. Again, it's not just knowing who God is and what He's about, but actually being changed in the process because of it. And so, again, all of these things are beginning to happen. And as we come into the one we have for today, which is finding fellowship, the reality is that you can't really do any of those three without having this one happen. That if you really consider it, you can't be recognizing God's work in other people unless you're actually around them. And you can sometimes sort of observe things from a distance, but you can't truly see the full reality unless you actually get to know them very well. And then you can fully see how God can truly change a person's life. And then there's the other reality of seeking biblical training. I don't know if any of you guys remember the list that Austin gave at the end of his sermon, but from what I remember, there was only one of them that you can actually do by yourself. Obviously, you can do your own personal reading and studying of the Bible, but the rest of them, you need other people to be helping you out in that process, especially ones who are more mature than you, to be knowing, to help leading you and show you the directions that you're supposed to be heading. So we need one another to get biblically trained, not just ourselves. And then even in walking toward Christ-likeness, it's not going to work very well if you're just doing it all by yourself. It's going to fade away at some point in time. And so that's really what this sermon comes down to, is showing you the importance behind that, and then getting you to see the necessity of actually finding fellowship in the process. And we can see how this happens in many different ways in life. I mean, you can take just normal examples of what's going on, and the simple reality that if you want to be doing something but you don't have the full motivation for it, you're not going to accomplish it very well by yourself. People often like to try to start living healthier, but you don't start eating right or actually exercising if again, you don't have the motivation to it. There are weird people like Crosby who actually like to do that kind of stuff. But for most of the rest of us, it works better if you have someone actually helping you or pushing you in some sense through the process. So it actually takes that having other people and encouragement by your side for you to do something like that. And it works just in the same manner, spiritually speaking, that if you're trying to do it all by yourself, you're not going to get very far with it if you don't have other people helping you out. I've had multiple instances where I've realized this over the course of my life. Not long after coming out here, I moved up to northern Idaho, and I didn't know anyone up there and really didn't end up meeting anyone. And it was sort of a whole mess, but it helped me see the point and the purpose behind actually needing other people. And even despite trying to go to church, though clearly not as much as I should have, but there were other issues in that area, I didn't connect in any sense with them. I partially blame this church for being too good at it, and not a lot of other places that I've found compared to it, but it also just didn't work out for one reason or another. And I found myself struggling with different things. It's sort of weird for me to say, but one of the biggest issues that I've had as a struggle, at least with sin in my life, has been pornography. And it's one of those things that's just, sort of a more personal level type thing, that I haven't had some of the other issues with it. And so for me, that's about all that really happened too much when I was by myself up there, because I wasn't actually dealing with other people. So, it's harder for some of those other things that can come out within our lives. So I don't want to say that's the only thing that I was doing to minimize it or in any sense, but it almost seems ridiculous in the way that I was trying to run away and go in the opposite direction from God, but yet it doesn't seem like I did too much. But yet I recognize that without having other people around, it can be a lot easier to fall in that, because the hardest time for the temptation of that is when you're by yourself in so many different ways. And when it's a longer lasting thing, it makes it harder. But there are other things without fellowship that can also become an issue. And I discovered this about 2.5 years ago when Joel and some other leaders in the church all got sick about the same time. We had to close down for, it was like 2.5 weeks. I think it was like 3 Sundays or something. But And so it wasn't just not having the Sundays, but it was also not me coming into the office and, getting annoyed by him and other people or whatever. But I didn't have much of anyone. I mean, I was technically around some of the people because I was living in the transition house, but it's still not the same as, actually being with those that I was used to being around. And I don't remember what exactly happened, but I remember during that time having this one thought that my focus was on something completely other than God for most of that period of time. I don't know there was anything necessarily bad or whatnot, but it was just, I came to that realization is that I think I wasted a whole bunch of time doing whatever when I could have actually been doing something to focus myself more on God. And that can be what happens when we get isolated, whether it's intentional or unintentional, whatever it is that can be a major struggle for us, is that it can lead us in directions that we might not necessarily want to go. And so I say all of this to help maybe for you to realize that maybe you've seen something like this in your life. I don't really know you guys that well to be able to understand things, but I mean, I've heard even from Larry tell a story about how there's been an issue for him that he recognized at a point in his life. I'm not going to go and share that story. He might if you ask him to. But yet, there are others who might see that same kind of thing. Maybe you've experienced it. Maybe you haven't been following Christ long enough to get there. I don't really know. But yet, that's what can truly happen. And so, I want you to sort of see that it can happen in various different ways. And it really does happen to all of us in one way or another. And so, that's why there really is an importance to finding fellowship. And I'm going to use this passage from Hebrews, which you may have heard partially quoted before. Verse 25 there is often used by a lot of people to say the reason that you need to be going to church, because you're not supposed to be forsaking the assembly. Of course, they really quote a small portion of that verse and ignore the rest of what it actually talks about. And I honestly could go on and on about saying how many of the things that are done in church nowadays really doesn't accomplish that at all, and that we've completely missed the point on a lot of things. I'm going to choose not to go off on that because that could take forever. But the point, but the point is that there is a need for fellowship, but it doesn't always look like possibly what you've been told that it looks like. And so that's what I want to show you today. I want to use this scripture and actually show you what it's actually saying. So, despite the fact that I only have verses 23 through 25 up there, I'm actually going to read for you more than that. So you can follow along in a Bible if you want, but I want you to hear some of the context of what's being said here, specifically what actually comes after these verses. There's going to be two different things that really are struggles that can happen and come up and cause issues if we're not in fellowship with one another. I don't know if you'll recognize it, I'll explain it later, but see if you can pick up on those two things that are happening in those verses that follow it, that can become problems for us if we're lacking it. So I'm going to start in verse 19 and read to the end of the chapter. It says, "Therefore, brothers, having confidence into the entrance of the holy things in the blood of Jesus, which he initiated a fresh and living way to us through the curtain that is his flesh, and he is a great high priest upon the house of God. Let us approach with a true heart and full assurance of trust, having been sprinkled, the hearts from an evil conscience, and having been washed, the body by pure water." And this is starting 23 now. "Let us hold fast the confession of the hope without wavering, for the one promising is trustworthy. And let us stare at or study one another into a feverish agreement of love and good works, not abandoning the assembly of ourselves, just as is the custom by some, but encouraging, and by so much more, as much as you are seeing the day drawing near. For us willingly sinning after the thing to receive the knowledge of the truth, a sacrifice is no longer left behind concerning sins, but a fearful expectation of judgment and zeal of fire being about to consume the adversaries. Anyone having rejected the law of Moses apart from mercies dies upon 2 or 3 witnesses. By how much more are you thinking will the one trampling underfoot the Son of God, and having considered the blood of the covenant ordinary, in which he was sanctified, be considered worthy of a worse punishment, and having insulted the Spirit of grace. For we know the one having said, Justice is to me, I myself will repay. And again, the Lord is judging his people. Fearful is the thing to fall into the hands of the living God. But remember the former days in which, having been illuminated, you endured a great struggle of sufferings. This, on the one hand, being publicly humiliated by both disgraces and afflictions, but this, on the other hand, having become sharers of the ones behaving in this way. For also you sympathized with the prisoners, and you willingly received with joy the robbery of the things existing of you, knowing to have yourselves a better and enduring possession. Therefore, do not throw off your confidence, which has a great deserved compensation. For you have a need of patient endurance, in order that, having done the will of God, you might receive the promise. For still a little while, the one coming will come and will not tarry, and my righteous one will live out of trust. And if he might keep himself back, my soul is not well pleased in him. But we ourselves are not of the keeping back into destruction, but of trust into a prized possession of the soul. There's so many good things in here, and I could honestly go on talking about that for a long time too. But we see the point of what's trying to be made here is the simple fact that we don't, obviously we need Jesus more than anything else, but we also need one another if we're going to go along of this journey of actually seeking and trying to serve him in the process, that we're going to fall short if we're trying to do it all on our own. And all these other things are going to come out because of it. And so for the most part, what's actually being said here comes in verses 24 and 25. But I use verse 23 here because when it says, let us hold fast the confession of hope without wavering, for the one promising is trustworthy, this is really the point he's trying to make in the midst of all of this, that this is the real thing that's supposed to be happening. We're supposed to be holding fast to that confession of hope that we've already made. If we've already made this, then we're supposed to continue on in it through the rest of our lives. And again, this is where it comes down to the fact that we're not going to do this very well if we're isolating ourselves and not having that fellowship with one another. That's why he goes on to say what he says. But it first starts with us recognizing why we're doing these things in the first place, that it's all about holding fast to what we already know and, serving the one who is promising and who is trustworthy to us. And then it goes on to here to say, and let us stare at or study one another into a feverish agreement of love and good works, not abandoning the assembling of ourselves, just as the custom by some, but encouraging, and by so much more, as much as you are seeing the day drawing near. So this is where he begins to point further forward with what the difference is that all of this is making. And this is very awkward wording because I'm using the one that Joel and I created, but yet there's some good things in it. Usually he would read it as, let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. But if you think about the reality behind it, to stare at or to study one another, you have to actually know another person if you're going to know how to encourage them in the first place. A lot of people, sort of go with the idea that you just tell some people some advice or you give them some good things to go off of, and it's just going to randomly change their life, and they're going to be able to go out and do it without any help from anyone, in the process. And again, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but it's not quite what encouraging or what we're really trying to do in the process is all about. And also the thing of being a feverish agreement of love and good works is that we're all supposed to be being about the same thing. It's a very strong way of saying being united in this thing. And we're supposed to be helping lead one another to be doing those things. You can see the wording of one another and all that kind of stuff ourselves throughout this, that it's not just about one person or another, it's about all of us together being united and heading in this very direction. And to sort of give you a slight grammar lesson on this thing to try to help understand it, we have to understand that basically the let us there was also one, the last verse and the verse before it, but they're basically commands in a sense. They're what they call a hortatory subjunctive, which I believe just takes the word from exhort or exhortation and uses that part of it, which basically is just a way of saying an encouraging command. It's something that's stronger than just encouragement, but yet it's not commanding as if you don't actually care about what's happening. There's an encouragement behind that command that's happening, and that's sort of what an exhortation is and sort of what's being said here and why it's used in that manner. And then you got the abandoning part there again, where people love to pick up, where it's just simply a participle explaining what's already been said. That we're supposed to be doing that first part, and you're not going to be doing it very well if you're abandoning the assembly. As well, people seem to, for whatever reason, stop verse 25 right before it says the but encouraging part. Never really understood why, but yet that's the exact, it's saying the antithesis of what's being said there. You're not supposed to be abandoning the assembly, but encouraging one another within it. That's really the entire point of what's being said there that oftentimes is left out. And so the reality is, if a church, whatever event or service or whatever, isn't actually doing those things of pushing one another towards love and good works or encouraging one another, it's not really actually fulfilling this. You could go to a church service that's doing a whole lot of things, but if it's not doing this, it's not actually being of any kind of a benefit to you. And that's what we're talking about when we're saying finding fellowship. It's about actually finding this, finding what's actually encouraging us to move on in that right direction, rather than just going and listening to someone talk for a while, singing some songs, and all these other things. There may be some people who are actually encouraged by that, but I find them very strange, and that doesn't make any sense to me, because it just doesn't do too much to me. I mean, seriously, most of us don't even remember what's said in the sermon not long after it's been said. I really never remember what in the world he talks about. If you ask me about a sermon, I could tell you what the scripture's about, but not necessarily what he said about it. But the whole point behind this is that we actually truly need to go deeper to encourage one another. Again, the stare at study part I find so important, because we have to really know each other, and that's where it begins. That all this has to be done in relationship with one another, and that's what we're truly seeking and heading toward. And so that brings me to that part of what comes after these, in verses 26 through 39 there. It says, "For us willingly sinning after the thing to receive the knowledge of truth, a sacrifice is no longer left behind concerning sins." He goes very strong in the wording that he goes following that. And it's also the point is, if we don't have that fellowship and encouragement with one another, it's real easy to fall back into whatever sin we're struggling with, into whatever we're doing, even going to the point of doing it willingly and not caring about the consequences that are behind it. Or the other part of it is, "But remember the former days in which, having been illuminated, you endured a great struggle of sufferings." That the suffering we receive, which ultimately culminates at the greatest one in persecution itself, is not something that we can endure or handle very well if we're trying to do it all by ourselves. I mean, I look back all the way to what the early church did, and to me it makes perfect sense that they met not just weekly but daily, for the sake that specifically when the persecution was coming, that if they didn't do it, they were probably going to fall away at some point, because they were being bombarded with it. And if you're not being, in some weird way, bombarded with God in the opposite direction, you're going to fall away from Him. And so with those are the two things that I was pointing out in the midst of it that he talks about, that to me it's just a way of saying that that the author of Hebrews goes on to talk about these things, is because that if you are forsaking the fellowship and not encouraging one another, those things become easy and they become major issues for us in that process. And so that's part of the reason why this is so important, that we need one another if we're going to continue and live in the right manner. Again, going back to what Joel talked about last week of walking toward Christ-likeness, you're not going to do it very well without having that fellowship. It sort of reminds me of one of the, I guess, quotes or whatever of the day that one of our professors would give us in Bible college before our classes. I'm pretty sure Joel already knows who I'm talking about, but he was one of our respected professors because he taught us Greek and everything else. But he gave us this, and I don't remember who actually said it or where he got it from, but it said that no one can be a secret disciple. that either the secrecy kills the discipleship or the disciple will kill the secrecy. And so it sort of works the same way with fellowship, that you can't be one by yourself. Either that isolation is going to kill anything that you had of following God, or eventually, because you recognize the need for being a disciple, it's going to get rid of that isolation. You're actually going to seek out others to help you along in that process. And so that's really what all of this is about. If we really want to be disciples of Him, if we really want to be heading in that direction, then we're going to have to get to the point of finding fellowship with one another. And so as we get to the takeaways of this, I do want to make one point about this, is the fact that I do have this recognition that I, in some senses, am not the best example of this, because I don't fully understand, even in some sense, how relationships work, because I haven't had many close ones over the course of my life for many different reasons. Again, I know I've talked about some of this before, and I don't want to bore you to death with any of that, but it's the simple reality that also because of that, I've recognized the need for this so much more than a lot of people will ever see. That because I've spent so much time not talking and mostly listening or watching other people, I can pick up on things and I can see some of those other things. And I can see even the own struggles of, well, having spent time with no one outside of my family and outside of this church, even the people here, even outside of it, for years, from what I can remember, that it's a real struggle, and you can feel the loneliness in ways that you would never expect to do. And there's just so much struggle in that I can see the full need of it. I still don't know really how to fix it or do everything about it, but I can see the need for it and help share it with you. So it's not the sense of me trying to tell you to do something that I'm not doing. It's more the sense of sharing this with you so that you can go along in the process along with me, and we can all figure this out together. Because it's not just about what we're doing, but it's also about your part in it as well. So we all have to walk through this process together, because, well, you don't really have fellowship without one another anyways. If it's all dependent on one person, I don't even know what that would be. It sort of misses the point. But the takeaways that I have here is that, first off, fellowship is a necessary part of the life of a disciple. Again, this is mostly what I've been trying to show and prove to you throughout this entire thing, that it's such a necessary part that you need to see it and understand it and actually be seeking it out because of that. And the other part to it is that it is your responsibility to find fellowship with other disciples. That it's not the responsibility of those in leadership to basically force you into it. I mean, we may annoy you enough until you actually go and do something about it. But it's not our responsibility for you to actually find it. You have to make that decision for yourselves. I mean, we can make the best programs or whatever it is for you guys to come to and have this fellowship with one another, but unless you actually come, unless you actually make that decision and commitment to be doing it in the first place, well, it's going to be a waste of our time, and it's just not going to actually accomplish anything for you in the first place. And so that's the point that I want you guys to really understand with this, is that you guys have a responsibility in this to actually be seeking it out and trying to find it. Again, we'll help you along in the process, but you have to actually make that decision for yourself. And so that's basically where I want to leave you with all of this. But I do want to give you guys sort of an update on what's been happening and what we're seeking to be doing basically to solve some of these issues. Obviously, again, I've still seen fellowship happening in this church way better than I've seen happening in any other church I've ever been to. But yet there's still more that we can do to actually grow deeper and know each other more and more, and to take what we have outside of just this church building and outside of just one, maybe two or whatever days a week, that it has to be something we're doing more in the sense of daily. And so we've been, for a while now, trying to figure out ways to develop different small groups to, be able to help move this beyond just this building and be able to get people together and starting to head in these directions. And while we're a little bit a ways away from actually implementing some of these, specifically the life groups that we're doing, there are other things like home Bible studies, or just you guys, it's not really a structured thing, but you guys just getting with one another and actually hanging out outside of this and seeing that friendships and relationships can be formed in ways like that. And if you guys have shared interests or whatever it is that you guys have or want to do, that there's so much more that we can do just beyond this building. But basically, it's coming down to the point of if you want that, just come and talk to us, and we'll figure out ways to even get this started before we're fully finished with getting it all set up. But once we do have this set up, again, it goes back to the fact that you guys are going to actually have to want to be a part of this for it to truly work. And it's not going to be a fully easy process, because it's always messy when people start getting to know each other and trying to figure things out. Even if I don't have a full understanding of that part's very clear, that it takes a lot of commitment and effort from each and every one of us. And so that's the direction that we're wanting to be heading, and that's the direction we want all of you guys to come along with us. And so those things are going to be coming soon. And again, if there's anything else that you guys want to help accomplish this, just come and talk to us, and we'll figure out whatever we can do to make sure that it's actually happening. That if you just want simply more study of the Bible, but at a different time than anything we offer, we can figure out some way that we can make it work. I mean, Joel will throw anyone under the bus to teach someone else. So even people who don't really want to do it, but anyways, that's just sort of an update of where we're going and how it relates to all this. Again, this has been such an important thing to me because of what I've seen and recognized within myself, and at times maybe a little selfish of trying to find ways to actually make it happen, because sometimes I feel people just don't want to be around me or whatever. I mean, I actually started praying recently that God would lift whatever it is that make people seem to avoid me. And I don't know whether this is actually a true thing or not, but it's always felt that way from my own perspective. I know I have issues with myself, so I'm not saying that it's everyone else's fault, but it's something that I'm hoping will somehow begin to get figured out over these periods of time. But again, all of us have to figure out how we're going to do this, and we want all of you to help us along in this process, because again, if we're planting His words of life and maturing disciples who are making disciples directed by God's word, it's all of our responsibility, and we all have to play some role, no matter how big or small in it. And so that's what we're seeking after, and that's what it really looks like to be a disciple.